Greetings! I come to you again from the pod future to talk about the coming dark age. The coming dark age of technology. I'm not talking about Warhammer Dark Age of Technology, but that's actually part of what I want to talk about today. I just want to muse a little bit on technological regression or regression of knowledge, culture, population, things like that. This can occur as part of like a dark age. I think a more technical definition of dark age is when a culture loses its ability to read and write. And one of the problems, I think, historically looking at dark ages is that there's not a lot of people around when a dark age begins to communicate how that dark age happened. You know, did the sea peoples come in and wreck the culture and destroy the economy, and then we ended up with the dark? Did they come in and kill all the scribes and then we forgot how to read and write? You know, what caused the dark age? Because people aren't around to read and write, and then the culture forgets how to read its past writings, so you're not really quite sure what the past writing might have meant. So, you know, at one point, ancient Greeks used a form of writing called Linear B. There's Linear A, which I think we can't read. I don't know if anybody recently has figured out how to read Linear A, but Linear B took a lot of work to decipher, and I think it's mostly lists of like supplies. So we're not really sure what the status of Linear B was in ancient Greece, or like, you know, if they wrote things on papyrus, but all of that got destroyed or something. And you had some kind of collapse, a Bronze Age collapse, and then you pick it up with a new form of writing, and you look back at Linear B and you're like, I don't know what they were writing. I don't know what our old culture was talking about. We've forgotten. We've entered a dark age and come out of the other side. Now that's happened in numerous cultures throughout history, but I'm thinking more in general terms of a regression, where there's a significant loss in knowledge and cultural status when some large precipitating event causes things to change dramatically. And I think hypothetically there's lots of ways that has happened in the past and could happen to our very highly technologically developed society. I'm not saying an actual dark age is going to happen, but I think a lot of people are not quite aware of the level of complexity and how many things are layered up to get to this point where, like, I'm talking to you on a magic television screen, and we actually, probably most of the people watching have no idea how the technology is really working between you and me. And even a computer engineer or a very knowledgeable programmer might have no idea about the net code running between me and you and what's going on there. You might know your little part of the internet, but not the whole thing. Knowledge becomes highly diffuse. So an example historically would be like the fall of the Western Roman Empire, where the city of Rome basically collapsed, and within a generation or two went from, a million people to like less than 100,000, I think 30,000 or something like that. Think about, that's like a decline of 90% within a couple of generations. That's a massive population decline. Now, does that mean those people died? No, they probably left Rome and went somewhere else. Rome's population of 1 million was supplied, I think for centuries, from grain dole that was acquired from like Egypt and other places, Sicily, outside of Rome. And so once all of that economic system went away, you couldn't have a city anymore. You couldn't have a big city because the surrounding land wasn't fertile enough, didn't produce enough food to support them on a basic level. So it had to disperse. And one of the things that you get with cities is cities allow you to have a really extreme amount of division of labor. And I've talked about this before. Division of labor is division of knowledge. And so when you disperse a city, all of that extreme division of labor and knowledge basically has to go away, because people move out into smaller communities that can be supported locally through shorter routes of trade for things like food. So you're going to have a significant regression in culture. You can't really have specialized artisans that just sit around painting highly detailed paintings unless you have really productive farmers, or you have the ability to pull food into a location where the artisan can actually get enough work to live in order to trade and buy the grain. So the artisans go away, the engineers go away, and then once you have them go away, the knowledge for how to do those things starts to go away as well. So you end up with 30,000 people in Rome living in the ruins of a society that they have no idea how to maintain. They have no idea how to maintain the aqueducts, for instance, or how they were built. They have no idea how the things around them were actually constructed because of the loss of knowledge. So this has happened numerous times in the past. In some cases, like the fall of Rome, we have a lot of records for what might have gone on during the fall of Rome. In other cases, like the Bronze Age collapse, those things are, it's mostly going to be conjecture. We're not really sure because there's not a lot of external scribes writing about it. When Western Rome collapsed, you still have a lot of literate cultures around Rome that were able to write. And it's not like all the scribes died in Rome. They didn't forget how to read and write. They had a massive decline. So let's talk about our society and how that kind of large-scale decline in the technological prowess of the society could actually happen. So if you're an author thinking about how am I going to write post-apocalyptica or something like that, or what if there's a collapse, if you're a prepper or something like that, these are things that I think about. So it all comes back to, actually I shouldn't say it all comes back to, let me start with the parable of the pencil. I don't have a pencil handy, but I have a pen, and this is going to be the same thing with the pen. No one knows how to make a pencil. You may have heard this in an economics lecture or something. There's a Milton Friedman video on YouTube that's very popular of him talking about the parable of the pencil. That no one can make a pencil. So just imagine I'm holding a pencil. Why? Well, because the pencil is made up of a bunch of materials, for instance, that can't really be made locally. So you have a pencil, lead, right, which is actually graphite, and it's maybe mined in one part of the world, like Brazil mines the graphite out of the ground. And then you have wood on the pencil, and the wood on the pencil comes from some pine trees, some trees that are cut down in Washington State or California or something, right? So you have two different locations that make the materials. Then you have the metal that holds the eraser on, and you have the eraser. So the eraser maybe comes from rubber trees in India. The metal is mined out of the ground in the Appalachian Mountains, or maybe it comes from Japan, or maybe it comes from some other country. So all of these different countries pull these things out of the ground and ship them across the globe because the economics determine that they can do that. They don't really know what the graphite's being used for, nor do they care. They just know that somebody, this pencil maker over in Mexico or the USA or wherever it is, they are going to pay for the graphite. So because somebody's going to pay for the graphite, we'll figure out how to mine it, and we'll figure out how to mine it as efficiently as possible to deliver a pencil that ends up being, 25 cents. And same thing for a big pen. There's plastic made out of oil, ink. I don't know what ink's made out of, but metal, brass. All of the stuff is sourced from different places, brought to one place, manufactured. So made by lots of different people engaging in lots of different economic activities who don't know each other and don't even know the purpose of what they're making, other than somebody is willing to pay money for it, and therefore we will do it. So when that overall system of international trade starts to break down, all of a sudden making a pencil becomes a harder task. But it's more than that, because what do you need to cut down the tree to make the wood of the pencil? Well, you need a saw or an axe. What are the materials of a saw and an axe? Well, you have iron because you have steel. Not only that, but you don't just have the materials, you have to have the knowledge for how to make that axe or how to make that saw. So you have to have a blacksmith or some other tool maker who knows how to take steel and forge it into an axe head. That's an acquired skill. He also has to have the equipment to forge the axe head, whatever that forge is going to be. Is it going to be a traditional forge where you have to light it with wood and with bellows, or is it going to be some newer technological forge, which is then supported by other technology, all of which has to come from somewhere? But at the simplest level, you have to have a blacksmith with a forge who knows how to use the forge and has to know how to turn that steel into an axe head, has to know how to put it on another bit of wood, an axe handle, which then has to be cut down from trees using steel. So you end up with the cycle where you're always using previous technology just to make the wood. Likewise, you have to have somebody who knows how to extract the metal from the ground, has to know how to make the equipment to get the graphite out of the ground, how to mine it, earth movers, all this sorts of stuff, boats, ships to move the product to where you're actually going to turn it into the final good, which you're going to deliver for 25 cents. All of that is underpinned by technology ranging from very simple to very, very complex. A lumberjack might use a chainsaw. The chainsaw requires an internal combustion engine. Somebody had to have the knowledge for how to design that internal combustion engine. Somebody had to have the steel to make it. Somebody had to have the shop to know how to set up the tools, to set up the machines to make it. So whenever you're manufacturing something in a complex modern economy, it's not as simple as make it, right? To make it by hand would be very expensive and very time consuming, though I guess you could do that even with some things. Like you could, I guess, forge an engine block if you had enough know-how and tools, but it would take forever to generate the tools to do it. So instead, we rely on a lot of other manufacturing methods to do it. And it's the same thing with like microchips. You have a very complex thing called a phone. Just to make the microchips in it, you have to have machines that make the microchips. So someone has to design the machine that's going to make the microchips. Someone has to design the software that's going to operate the microchips. And the machine that makes the microchips is itself made of microchips, which are made on another machine, which had to be designed. You see, there's this big, long regression where to make I don't know what the new standard, like a 10 nanometer chip, right? This new 10 nanometer chip that's existing on some graphics cards. In order to make that, you had to use a machine that was using a 15 nanometer chip. And then that machine had to be made with another machine that was using a 20 nanometer chip, all the way down until you're getting to transistors, and before that vacuum tubes, and before that just like wires and trying to make electrical current. So everything is built on everything else. And so whenever there's a regression in technology, we lose some of the knowledge for how we're making that. Like if you imagine there's some kind of precipitating event and all the engineers who know how to make the 10 nanometer thing are killed. Well, at least we can still make the 12 nanometer setup, and then maybe we can use that to make the 10 nanometer again. But depending on how much of that interconnected and extreme pyramid of technology is destroyed, you have to go back a lot of different steps. And in some cases, to go back those further steps, the knowledge is no longer there, right? If we were to have to go back to transistors and vacuum tubes, there's still people around who know how to do it, but they're getting old. In another 50 years, if we were having to back up to that stage, people would have to be hitting the books. They'd have to be looking at books for how to make this stuff. You'd have to be going back in time to try to generate the knowledge for how to hand wire amplifiers and transformers and things like that, which is something my grandfather did. He hand wired computers for Texas Instruments. Imagine doing that now. Imagine that job now. He's like, oh, he's a computer engineer, and his job was to literally wire computers. The computers that were used in, say, the lunar module or the command module that went to the moon were made by Texas Instruments by hand by some guy soldering them together who had the knowledge for how to solder those things together. You're going to have to rebuild that knowledge. So if you imagine going back in time, you can see that it's very difficult to escape a cycle of basic technology because a big impact event can wipe out your knowledge. So in the case of the fall of Rome, this very complex economy that involves lots of highly differentiated knowledge, something that basically underpins that, which is the ability to import food, basic political stability, once that goes away, everybody basically has to leave the city because they can't continue to live there. It's just something they can't do. They have to go off and go back to something basic like learning how to farm. So once you have a big event like that, you can easily see how that regression happens. If you imagine something like the Black Plague comes through, and even if it kills 10% of the people of your village, which 10 people could make a big impact, have a big impact on your community? If it kills the blacksmith and blacksmith's apprentice, no one knows how to use the forge. What do? Luckily, there might be another village with another blacksmith that could, you could send someone to go learn how to be a blacksmith for your village maybe. But if somebody has some very technical knowledge dies without passing on that knowledge, or it's limited to a small number of people and they die, all of a sudden you have technological reversion. And that's how I think it could happen, say, with our society. Now, I'm going to give you some interesting scenarios. This is something that I've thought about, and nuclear power is something that I now think is maybe not a good thing. There's lots of people who are very pro-nuclear power. They're like, it's very efficient. It's very clean as far as emissions to the atmosphere goes. You can have thorium reactors that will reduce the amount of excess waste basically to nothing. nuclear power looks like, man, it's a really good option. But people have this idea in their mind, like, oh, what about, these nuclear disasters like Chernobyl or something? What's going to stop us from having Chernobyl? It's like, oh, well, we've gotten past that. That was, in the Soviet Union, blah, blah, blah. It's modern Western place. We're safe here in France. France gets a lot of its power from nuclear power. But what happens in the future when there's a demographic switch? And you get something like what you get in South Africa, where the body politic becomes completely controlled by a majority which has a socioeconomic status that's reduced compared to the minority, which has controlled those things, and also possibly has just in general a reduced capacity to operate the technology that the previous controlling minority had. In other words, if the whites in South Africa build a nuclear power plant, the blacks take it over and say, we're going to kick the whites out and we're going to put black engineers in, because it's going to be like Pol Pot. We're going to take the doctor out of the surgery room and we're going to put the peasant in there, because all of this is artificial and we don't believe that anybody is in any position because of something special about their intellect or merit. It takes a certain kind of person to be a nuclear engineer. I have a great uncle who was one. A very, 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 very smart guy. So when that intelligence is no longer available, what do you do with a nuclear power plant? You put someone in there that has a lower aptitude, and that's when you're going to have problems. Now, in the better case scenario, it would be the nuclear power plant has to shut down, and then you have a power shortage. And when you have a power shortage, all this technology we have suddenly becomes of a diminished use, significantly diminished use. The internet requires power to run on a basic level. It requires wires going from one place to the other. If you can't power on your server room, the internet's not going to work next to you. You know what I mean? So that's the best case. The worst case would be you have like a meltdown in a nuclear disaster because there's no one available who knows how to maintain and run that nuclear power plant and maintain its safety. Now, you could have a coal power plant explode as well. I don't want to just say it's nuclear, but it's something that could happen, is that because of demographic changes or political changes, if you have a significant political revolution, and this is 20th century has many records of this, you have a decision to remove privileged people from their positions where they are supporting, it's kind of like Atlas holding the world up. They're supporting the society with their technical knowledge, and replace them with other people without realizing that highly specialized knowledge isn't magically transferred. When you put someone in there, you're going to have disasters. You actually have this with farming in African countries, where you take the land away from the white farmers, and all of a sudden the black farmers can't produce as much crops on it. Why? Well, they didn't know how to farm, right? That knowledge was something that the farmers before acquired and learned to do, and required a certain amount of aptitude and intelligence. And just throwing someone on a plot of land doesn't equal high volume farming. It doesn't work that way. Farming's a skill. I know, because I'm surrounded by agriculture. To some extent, I am a farmer because I've been in agriculture basically all my life. And it is a skill that is built up with knowledge. It's something that can't just be discovered by looking at an empty plot of land or some cattle on it, and then you're like, oh, I know how to cattle ranch because there's cattle eating grass. Well, there's more to it than that, and so if you just take away the land from the white farmers, you're going to have a famine. You're going to have an economic collapse, and then you're obviously with food scarcity, you're going to end up with problems where you can't divide labor very much. At the very basic level, if there's not a really secure source of food, you can't have this high division of labor that allows a very technological society. So a plague could come through, and if it kills the correct 10%, you have a diminished knowledge that could really heavily impact the country and have significant regression. I'll give you one more example too, which is we can't go to the moon. We can't go back to the moon. Why can't we go back to the moon? All right? People who believe in the moon hoax, they're like moon hoaxers. They're like, oh, NASA deleted the tapes, or they taped over these telemetry tapes. And yes, it's very complicated to do all of the mathematical work related to launching something into space. It's not easy. It's a very difficult thing to do, and requires a lot of smart people working together and being very accurate with their math in order to send someone to the moon. But it's more than that, because we don't have any Saturn V rockets. We don't have any more Saturn V rockets. Why can't we just build another one? We built them before. Well, that Saturn V rocket was built on other technology. Remember, you need a forge to make an axe. You need a forge and an anvil to make an axe. Someone had to know how to make that forge. Someone had to know how to make that axe. If you have a chainsaw, you have to have an internal combustion engine in the chainsaw. Well, all the tooling, all the manufacturing things that were used to make the Saturn V rocket don't exist. Once that capital equipment is no longer needed, it's discarded or recycled into different uses. So you'd basically have to either design a new rocket and a way to make it from the ground up, or you have to go back and remake all the tools that you used to make the rocket in the first place in order to make another Saturn V rocket to send another people to the moon. You'd have to rebuild everything from scratch. So it's not as simple as build another one, because building another one requires building all the things like tools required to build another one. And to build the tools required requires other tools to build those tools. You have to go find those or make them. So our technology is built on so many different layers that, and it progresses in such a way that if we have lost some past part of it, it's very difficult to recover. You maybe encounter this with like older computer systems that have been running, there's like transistor computers in Japan that have been running for like 50 years somehow because they still run what they were designed to run. There's no reason to replace them, but the transistors are burning out, and the people who know how to change those cards are like in their 80s now. So they're taking out transistor cards and replacing those transistors. What happens when that guy's dead and no one's left who knows how to change out those transistors? Now you're going to have to redo a whole system with different technology. The know-how, the knowledge for how to use that technology goes away. Maybe you're thinking, oh, well, I need to fix a chip on my Nintendo Entertainment System, right? Oh, I mean, it's old technology. It's probably pretty easy. It's like, well, no one makes those chips anymore. Oh, well, maybe there's a market for making the chips. How do we make them? Well, they were made on machines which don't exist anymore. That capital equipment was scrapped because no one was buying NESs in the 90s. Why would we keep that equipment around? We wouldn't. We'd repurpose it or scrap it or recycle it or whatever it's going to be. So making old parts to old technology all of a sudden becomes very, very difficult because you've lost the capital equipment that you used to make those things in the first place. So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. Leave me your thoughts down below about maybe some examples from history that you can think of where we entered a dark age of technology. Now, I really like this with, say, like Warhammer 40K, because they had this idea that there was this age of technology where mankind spread out across the stars, and the technology was lost as you had this all this bad stuff happened, like demons coming out of the warp. So somehow the technology was lost and mankind is trying to recover that technology. They're using technology from the past and they don't even fully know how it works. This is a thing in Battletech too. It's like we don't know how the battle mechs really work. We're constantly scavenging old parts because we can't make them. We don't know how to make them. You're living after the technology and you've lost the ability to remake the technology. You are living in like a dark age in a sense, or you're living after the dark age of technology because you don't know what was going on in the age of technology, but it's sitting there. You're like, oh, how do I use this? We have to rediscover how to use it. And it becomes almost a religious thing, like Tech Priests of Mars, trying to conjure up a use for technology that has been forgotten in like this 10,000 year span where people actually maintain their technology. So a big event could actually significantly disrupt economic activity, which means you can't make pencils, right? You can't make technology when you have significant economic disruption. We've seen that this year with COVID, but I mean, something even bigger that could halt international trade would be a bigger blow to what's going on technologically, where you really can't replace what's going on. You have to rebuild large amounts of technology. And how do you do that when the technology you used to build the technology has been scrapped 20 years ago? Interesting stuff to think about. So thanks so much for listening to this little diatribe if you listen to it, and leave me your thoughts down below, because this is just some stuff I've been thinking about and I think it's really interesting. Very rich for fiction. I mentioned Warhammer does it and Battletech. Both of those had a vision of the future where like we could lose the technological know-how that we had in the past. And I think not being able to go back to the moon is a really good example. You'd have to rebuild a huge amount of things, many layers of technology in order to get back to building a rocket capable of going to the moon. But maybe, maybe it'll happen. Maybe it'll happen in the private. Maybe Elon Musk will do it. That'll be cool. But he's building a space program basically from the ground layer. You can't just go back and rebuild what you had before because you lost all the tools. So thanks so much, guys, and I'll see you next time. I remember a quote from, I think it was Ghost in the Shell, which is over-specialization breeds in weakness. So, and I shall return to the pod future where we still use smartphones from 2012. I will see you all next time. Oh, I have a new book out. It's called Krampus Christmas. It's a big collection. It's like the Fantasy Christmas Spectacular, but some of the same books, like Muramasa Blood Drinkers in there, Voices of the Void is in there, but it's also got a lot of new content too, including a brand new fantasy horror novella. So thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.